O Fronteiras do Pensamento apresenta a primeira parte da conferência Educação no século XXI, com Howard Gardner. O psicólogo fala sobre sua teoria das inteligências múltiplas. Acompanhe.
The traditional view of intelligence goes back about 100 years, and it consists of a number of points. First of all, intelligence is a single thing. Psychologists use the English letter G to describe general intelligence. Intelligence is highly heritable. That means it's carried in the human genes. So if you know how smart your parents are, or even better, if you know how smart your grandparents are, you can predict how smart you will be. Since it's part of the human genome, you can't do much about it. You are stuck with your general intelligence. Now, these are all views that I disagree with. I don't think this view is correct, but you can understand a new view better if you contrast it with the former view. Now, what's interesting is this traditional view of intelligence is a Western view, Europe and the Americas. If you go to East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, you get a very different view, a Confucian view, which says that how smart you are depends primarily on your effort, how hard you work. About 30 years ago, I began to develop an entirely different way of thinking about intelligence, not based on paper and pencil test, not based upon looking at brain waves, but rather an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approach which focused on how abilities have evolved over thousands and even millions of years, how the brain has evolved, and how it's organized today in human beings. What are the different abilities which were valued in pre-literate times, in small clans in East Africa and in the South Seas and at the Arctic Pole? What do we know from special populations? Prodigies, savants, idiosavants, people with autism, all of whom have very jagged profiles. They're good in some things, average in some things, below average in some things. There's no way that the traditional view of intelligence can explain this kind of scatter. I put all of these disciplinary findings together. I established a set of 8 criteria drawn from anthropology, history, psychology, genetics, neurology, and I came up with a multiple theory of intelligence. For me, an intelligence is a potential to process information that comes in through your eyes or your ears or your hands so that you can solve problems or make things which are valued in at least one culture or community. That's the definition, but I think an analogy or metaphor works better. The traditional view of intelligence suggests we have a single mainframe computer inside our skull. And if that computer works well, you're smart in everything. If it works average, you're average in everything. If it works slowly, you're kind of dumb in everything. I believe we have several computers in our mind brain. Language computers, music computers, personal computers, and so on. And there are probably a few people where all the computers work well, a few people where none of the computers works well, but most of us are an amalgam, a combination of some computers that are quite good, some computers that are average, and some computers which don't work very well. That, in essence, is multiple intelligence theory. The first intelligence, linguistic intelligence, is the intelligence of the writer, the orator, the poet, the journalist, people who use language as their major activity. The second intelligence is logical mathematical intelligence. That's the intelligence of the mathematician or the scientist. Most intelligence tests only look at those two intelligences. And they're important for school, especially a Western secular school, as we had in Europe and then in the Americas in the 20th century. Whether it's appropriate for a digital school of the 21st century, nobody knows. If you're good in language and logic, you will succeed at most Western schools. And as long as you stay in school, you'll think you're smart. But if you should ever navigate the streets of Sao Paulo in an automobile, or you should ever try to survive in the Amazon, you will discover that there are other kinds of intelligence which are at least as important. Musical intelligence, the intelligence of performers, singers, composers, conductors. I understand now in Brazil there is a movement to get more young children able to play the violin and other instruments. That's musical intelligence. A fourth intelligence is spatial intelligence, the intelligence that allows us to navigate wide space, like a sailor or an airplane pilot, or more local kinds of space, like a sculptor or chess player. My example of spatial intelligence is an architect, and I was delighted to learn that one of the world's most famous architects, Oscar Niemeyer, is still alive, over 100 years of age, and still working in Brazil. That gives us a lot of hope. A fifth kind of intelligence is bodily intelligence, the intelligence of the athlete, the dancer. Someone like Pele undoubtedly has a lot of bodily kinesthetic intelligence. It's also the intelligence of a craftsperson or a surgeon, people who use their whole bodies or parts of their bodies, like their hands or their mouth, to solve problems or to make things. Interpersonal intelligence is the intelligence of understanding other people. Obviously, it's important for leaders, teachers, clinicians, salespeople, people who are in religion, who have a congregation. All of those involve interpersonal intelligence. Some people call it social intelligence. A very interesting intelligence is intrapersonal intelligence, understanding of yourself. Having a good model of who you are, what your strengths are, what you're trying to achieve, what happens when something goes wrong. It's a very important intelligence we don't know anything about how to teach it. An eighth intelligence, which I did not write about until 10 years ago, is the naturalist intelligence. It's the intelligence that allowed us to recognize the differences between plants, between animals, between rock formations, between clouds, the world of nature. None of us would be here if our ancestors had not known what to eat and what not to eat, what animals to pursue, which animals to run away from. But now, most of us don't have to work in the world of nature. We just go to the grocery store. But the parts of our brain which evolved to discriminate in the world of nature, we now use for consumption. Which automobile to buy, which sneakers to buy. We use that part of the mind-brain to navigate the world of consumption. There might be a ninth intelligence, which I call the existential intelligence. It's the intelligence of big questions. What's going to happen to us? Does God love me? What is love? What is God? I think this is a useful concept, but I'm not certain, because I would like to know whether there are parts of the brain which evolved to deal with questions which are too big or too little to perceive, these questions of existence. Some educational claims have emerged over the last 25 years. I want now to talk about the kinds of minds that we need in the future. So, globalization. Imagine with me megacities like Sao Paulo or Mexico City, where millions and millions of people have to live together, work, find ways of dealing with one another, even if they are of very different backgrounds. Think about brands which travel around the world. Fast food chains, movies, automobiles, clothing. So these are all examples of globalization, the movement of money, customs, and populations. The second feature is the biological revolution. Every month we're learning more about the brain. Every month we're learning more about genetics. And that information is going to affect education in very powerful ways. In your lifetime, students will come to school with a picture of their brain, a functional MRI, and a gene chip with their own unique genome, and they will say to teachers, "Teach me in a way that I can learn." And if the teachers cannot make sense of the brain image or the gene chip, then education will become a medical specialty because, of course, doctors and scientists are trained to read about the brain and to read about genetics. And already, and this is something I study, we can tell very early in life if a child is going to have reading problems, if the child is at risk for dyslexia, and we're beginning to know what kind of treatment will work for what kind of language problem. And the same thing will happen with each of the intelligences. So the biological revolution will have enormous impact in education, though only in the most specialized settings is it evident at the present time. The third revolution is the digital revolution. Computers, the World Wide Web, the Internet, all of these things are already beginning to have impact in education. And it's a situation very unusual, where young people are much more sophisticated than older people. We distinguish between digital immigrants, which are most of you, and your children, who are digital natives. And I'm a digital paleolith, but I'm trying to study and understand the new digital media, because those are also huge changes that are occurring in our society. One other one I will mention is lifelong learning. In my grandparents' generation, most people didn't have even a secondary school education. In my parents' generation, most people didn't have to learn once they finished secondary school or the university. Now, of course, education everywhere has to be lifelong. And so, not only do we need to know how we can continue to learn, but thank goodness we now know the brain is able to acquire new information for many, many years after adolescence. So now I'm going to introduce 5 Minds for the Future, which is a book that was recently published in English and also in Portuguese and Spanish. But in fact, this is not a book about psychology. It's not a book about the brain. It's a book about policy. What are the kinds of minds that we need to develop in the 21st century? So the first mind, next slide, is the disciplined mind. The disciplined mind. And the disciplined mind has 3 different connotations. First of all, discipline means working steadily at things and getting better. The second sense of discipline is to master the major ways of thinking that human beings have developed in the last few thousand years. Thinking mathematically, artistically, scientifically, historically. By the time young people finish secondary school, the traditional view of intelligence goes back about 100 years, and it consists of a number of points. First of all, intelligence is a single thing. Psychologists use the English letter G to describe general intelligence. Intelligence is highly heritable. That means it's carried in the human genes. So if you know how smart your parents are, or even better, if you know how smart your grandparents are, you can predict how smart you will be. Since it's part of the human genome, you can't do much about it. You are stuck with your general intelligence. Everybody needs to be an expert in at least one thing. An expert artist, or craftsperson, or professional. Because if you're not a professional expert, either you will not have a job, or you will work for somebody else who's an expert. Because anything that can be automated will be automated. Many jobs which existed even 25 years ago are done as well or better by computers than they are by human beings. So it's extremely important for everyone to be disciplined enough to master a discipline if he or she wants to succeed in the 21st century. The second mind, prossimo, is the synthesizing mind. And I think this is the most interesting mind. It's the one that I've thought the most about. Today, everybody is inundated, overwhelmed by information. anything that you look up on the internet, you could spend the rest of your life reading about that topic and going to all the links. So the synthesizing mind has many jobs. It has to decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And it needs criteria for making that separation. The synthesizing mind has to put together material so you can hold on to it. If you can't organize it in a way that makes sense to you, you will forget it. And if you are in the business of communicating as a teacher or as a worker, you need to be able to convey your synthesis to other people. Now, in a way, educators have always had to synthesize. But we haven't really been mindful, reflective about how we do it. But in the 21st century, we need to understand our synthesizing well enough so that we can help students become better synthesizers. And that means you need to have criteria for judging syntheses. Because not every synthesis is good. Just like every textbook is not good. So you need to have the criteria to judge: is the synthesis balanced? Is it too broad? Is it too narrow? Is it eccentric in some way? And I thought that my field of psychology would have answers to this question, but it doesn't. So the challenge of understanding how we synthesize and being able to do it well, I think, will characterize the 21st century. The third kind of mind is the creating mind. This is the mind that goes beyond discipline, beyond synthesis, and explores the unknown, asks new questions, comes up with new puzzles, proposes new solutions. In English, we talk about thinking outside the box. The creating mind thinks outside the box. But you cannot think outside the box unless you have a box. And the box is the discipline and the synthesizing. Because if you don't have a box, you might come up with something new, but probably you will just reinvent the wheel. The trick, the secret, is to learn the discipline and the synthesizing when you're young. Because then there's more time to think outside the box. As you get older, the box gets more and more congealed, sclerotic. It's more difficult to change. And so creativity is easier when you've mastered the discipline, but the discipline hasn't become a blinder that hides outside the box. The two other minds have less to do with cognition in the usual sense and more to do with how we relate to other human beings. They are the respectful mind and the ethical mind. Prossimo. The respectful mind is easy to explain, but difficult to achieve. The respectful mind begins with a recognition that people are very different from one another. We look different, we have different beliefs, different tastes, and so on. It takes diversity as a fact of life. Now, when people are different from you, you can kill them, or they can kill you. You can tolerate them, which is better than intolerance. But the respectful mind tries to understand other people, tries to work with them, tries to make a positive out of human differences. From infancy, children can tell whether their environment is respectful. How do parents treat one another? How do children treat one another? When you go to school, how do teachers treat the staff, treat parents, treat children? Respect is quite manifest. It's easy to see, but it's not easy to achieve, and much of the world is characterized by disrespect. In fact, I don't know about Brazilian television, but if it's anything like U.S. television, it's filled with examples of disrespect, people putting down other people and not trying to understand them. There are lots of examples of disrespect. When you're nice to people who have more power, but you are nasty to people who have less power. When you tell jokes which are at the expense of groups. When you respect other people, but you have a whole set of conditions, and if they don't meet those conditions, then you don't respect them. This doesn't mean that we should respect Adolf Hitler, but it does mean we should give people a second chance. The next slide suggests that there are ways to bring about respect when it hasn't existed. There are political ways, commissions on peace and reconciliation, which try to bring together groups that were in conflict. There are efforts in music, in the arts, in athletics, to have teams from different countries cooperate rather than fight. And I don't know much about the history of Brazil, but I think that Brazil has an advantage over most countries in that diversity is so much a part of your history and is so much a part of your population that you've already learned a lot. The comparison with Western Europe is very stark because until 50 years ago, the population of each Western European country was quite homogeneous. France for French, Germans for German, and so on. Now, of course, Western Europe is filled with people from East Europe, from the former Soviet Union, from the Mediterranean, from North Africa, from the Far East. And as you probably know, European countries have a much more difficult time dealing with this diversity than places like the United States or Brazil, which have had a very diverse population for centuries. The final mind is the ethical mind. And it's somewhat more difficult to explain than the respectful mind. And it's also the one that I've been working on for the last 15 years. Respect, as I say, begins in infancy, and every infant can see if the people in the community respect one another. Ethics requires abstraction, the ability to step outside of yourself as a person and to think of yourself as a worker and as a citizen. So, I'm Howard Gardner, and from an early age, I could see whether people respected one another, and you could see whether I was respectful of them, and vice versa. But only as I became an adolescent could I think of myself as a worker, in this case as a scholar or teacher, and as a citizen of my community, of my country, and increasingly we are all citizens of the planet. We live in a global time, and whether it's advertisements or diseases or global warming, all these phenomena affect the whole planet. People who are ethical think about what is the right thing for them to do in their job and what is the right thing for them to do as citizens. And it's not enough to think about what the right thing is. Of course, you have to do the right thing. So, many of you are educators. It's easy to talk about what your rights are as your educator, but what are your responsibilities? What are the right things you should do when it comes to a case of cheating or a case where your boss tells you one thing but you don't think it's good for students, or if parents come in and try to pressure you one way or the other? Ethical means, what does it mean to be a teacher? What does it mean to be a physician? What does it mean to be a lawyer or judge? That's what ethics is. And you are all citizens. Most of you are citizens of Porto Alegre, of the state, of the nation, the Brazilian nation. I guess you're also citizens of Mercosur. But more importantly, you're citizens of the planet. And again, human rights are wonderful, but what are your responsibilities? What are your responsibilities for the environment? What are your responsibilities for voting? If you're sick, should you go on an airplane? If you have swine flu or H1N1, what are your responsibilities as a citizen? So the ethical mind thinks about what's the right thing to do, not just what's good for you for your own personal self-interest. For the last 15 years, Prossimo, I've been asking the question, what should we use our minds for? What should we use our intelligences for? We have minds, we have intelligences, but how should they be used? How should they be applied? Prossimo. And I've written a book with two colleagues, Damon and Csikszentmihalyi, and as the cover says, we've been studying good work, qualificado. Good work involves three words which in English all begin with the letter E. And I guess in Portuguese also. Good. One E is excellent, expert. Good work is a very high technical level. The second E, it's engaging, it's meaningful. You want to do it. The good worker looks forward to Monday morning. He doesn't dread going to work on Monday morning. And the third E, the good worker is ethical, moral, tries to do what is socially responsible, not just what's good for you yourself. Prossimo. Another picture. The good worker has three strands: excellence, ethics, and engagement. You know the double helix DNA. This is the triple helix ENA. And if a person is a good worker, he or she is a combination of excellence, engagement, and ethics. You can be excellent but unethical. You can be engaged but not excellent. You can be ethical but do inferior work. So it's very difficult to be a good worker, but that's what we should strive for. And the same analysis applies to citizenship. A good citizen is excellent. He or she knows the rules, the laws, the regulations. He or she is engaged, cares, votes, reads the newspaper, goes to meetings, is part of the society, and the good citizen is ethical. The good citizen doesn't just try to promote his or her self-interest. The good citizen says, what's the right thing to do for the larger polity? Prossimo, I have a little elevator speech for respect and ethics. Whom do we respect? We respect people who are ethical, who do the right thing, not just what's in their own self-interest. And of course, I know enough about the United States and I know enough about Brazil to say that many people do not behave ethically, and that's very bad for the larger society. We're in a digital age now, so one question I've asked is, what will happen to the 5 minds in an age of social networks and multitasking and instant messaging? Respect and ethics are going to be difficult in the digital era because it's easier to be respectful and ethical if you see people face to face every day, as we did in small neighborhoods. But so much contact now is impersonal via the internet. People can have all kinds of different identities in social networks. People can be quite deceptive. And I think we have to work out over the next decades new kinds of ethics which are appropriate to the digital age. Many of you are educators, and so a common question is, how can we be aware of the 5 minds? We should always be looking for examples from history or from the news of respect or disrespect. I said how our American television is so filled with disrespect, and that's very unfortunate. When there are examples of respect, we should honor those. Of course, as educators, it's more important that we ourselves model and explicate and embody these minds. So whenever possible, we should show how to respect, how to synthesize, how to create. Also, it's important to identify negative examples, syntheses which don't work, false creativity, lack of discipline, disrespect, unethical behavior. And there needs to be consequences. If somebody continues to be unethical in a community, they need to be identified and punished. We've been working on this, but I'm not going to describe that work now. But instead, I want to say that these 5 minds don't necessarily fit together comfortably. There's a conflict between discipline and creativity. If you're too disciplined, you'll probably never do anything creative. So there's a conflict there. There's also a conflict between respect and creativity. If you have a teacher, you owe the teacher respect, but often creativity means overthrowing, critiquing your own teacher, and that can be very uncomfortable. And so in the end, ultimately, everybody has to create his or her own synthesis. We need to find ways to get these 5 minds to work together comfortably. That's actually a job of intrapersonal intelligence. How do you understand yourself well enough to get these different minds to work together? I have some slides of people who I think are good citizens. One is Nelson Mandela, probably the most admired human being on the planet. Another one is Mahatma Gandhi, who I think was the most important figure of the last 1,000 years in terms of human relations, but it's much too early to know whether Gandhi's example will be accepted even in his own country. Because Gandhi showed how people can disagree and conflict without hurting one another. And of course, in the nuclear age, that's a tremendous imperative. And the third slide is somebody who has been in the news recently, but I often have shown her, and this is Aung San Suu Kyi, the dissident in Myanmar who has lived under house arrest for most of her adult life, trying to introduce more democratic processes in that military regime. Now, none of us in this room is likely to be Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi or Aung San Suu Kyi, but nonetheless we can learn from people like that. We can be inspired by them, and that's important as well. So I now want to summarize and conclude. I said that I began as a psychologist over 40 years ago, and I developed a new view of the mind and intelligence, drawing on psychology, but also on brain studies and evolution and genetics. And these ideas are still controversial in psychology, but they've had a lot of influence in education, and I hope and believe that influence has been benign. And I mentioned that an education based on MI should individualize, take individual differences very seriously, and computers can help. And it should pluralize. It should present important ideas in many ways so we can activate many intelligences and many neural networks. I then took off the psychology hat and the educator hat and talked in terms of policy. What kinds of minds do we need in an era of globalization, biological revolution, and digital revolution? And I argued that there are 5 kinds of minds. 3 of them are primarily cognitive: the disciplined mind of becoming an expert by working hard in one area; the synthesizing mind, which can survey a wide territory and organize it so it can be retained; and then the creating mind, which goes one step beyond orthodoxy and thinks new ideas. And then I mentioned the 2 ideas from human relations: face-to-face respect of people who don't necessarily come from your clan, and the imperative of ethics in workplace and in citizen, where you don't just do what serves your own self-interest, but you try to think about what the right thing to do is. And then I talked about our own work in ethics, using the mind in ways which can be helpful for the broader society, which are ethical as well as excellent. So I want to close by quoting 2 Americans who I think said something very wise. Cosimo, the first one is Martin Luther King Jr., and he said, "Intelligence plus character, that's the goal of a true education. Intelligence, being smart, is good. Having multiple intelligence is good. But the kind of person you are is equally important." A quotation from a 19th century American philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson. He went one step beyond Martin Luther King. He said character is more important than intellect. So many of you here are educators, and those of you who are not educators are probably workers or parents, And even though intelligence is tremendously important, and multiple intelligences are very important, it's the way that you use those intelligences which is what's most important. Thank you.
Você assistiu à segunda parte da palestra Educação no Século XXI, com Howard Gardner. Todo mês, você acompanha aqui, na URGS TV, mais um especial Fronteiras do Pensamento. Obrigado pela companhia e até breve.